Sexual fantasies, used well, are not about replacing your current experience or your spouse, but kind of like those Russian nesting dolls, sexual fantasies add another layer or dimension to the core of the good that you already enjoy as a couple. Welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I'm your host, Dan Purcell, a Christian marriage and intimacy expert and coach. I'm on a mission to help couples have the best sex and most emotionally intimate marriages possible. Our episodes cover topics you've always wondered about and are packed with practical advice designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. Have you ever traveled somewhere new and fell in love with your new surroundings while at the same time it deepened your appreciation for where you came from? A few weeks ago, Emily and I dropped off our oldest son in Virginia for his first year of college. He's an avid tennis player and attending Southern Virginia University, a small private liberal arts school in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. It was my first time visiting that part of the country. We immediately fell in love with the charm of the area, probably because it's so different. The landscape is green, first of all, as opposed to our red and coral desert landscape that we're used to here in southern Utah. The towns in the area are small and spread out. There's white picket fences and pastures with horses grazing. The people were friendly and welcoming. And our Airbnb where we stayed was upstairs from a bakery, which is an excellent idea, by the way, on a hobby farm. It wasn't long before I opened up the Zillow app and started looking at real estate that's available in the area. And by the way, real estate in rural Virginia is a fraction of the cost of where it is where we live now. It wasn't long until my wife and I started to, talk about what it might be like if we lived out there instead of St. George. Anyway, after being away for a week, we came home with fresh eyes to our own hometown. The Crimson Mountain to our east that I see every day all of a sudden took on a new beauty, especially at sunset. The wide open skies and sandstone actually do have their own type of beauty. I also appreciate the familiarity I have with our own city, and I value how convenient it is for us to live here. Exploring what it might be like living someplace else helped me gain a fresh appreciation for what I already have. You see, sexual fantasies can do that for you too. They let you explore and try on new ideas to break away from the mundane and the ordinary. When used properly, they can deepen your appreciation for what you have as well as take your relationship to new heights. I hope that by the end of this episode, you're convinced of the value of sexual fantasies in your relationship, as well as you'll walk away with specific tools on how you can use your sexual fantasies to deepen your intimate connection as a couple, as well as make sex really fun and exciting. Along the way today, I'm going to answer questions I've received from many of you, such as, I'm embarrassed to tell my husband that I fantasize during sex. Is there anything wrong with that? Or, how do I tell my spouse about my fantasies? Or, I asked my wife what her sexual fantasies are. She said she doesn't have any. Find it hard to believe that she doesn't have any sexual fantasies. Does she really not have any? Or is she just reluctant to tell me? I'm embarrassed about my fantasies. They're inappropriate. What's wrong with me? Or, my spouse keeps telling me about his fantasies and I'm put off by it. How do I tell him how I feel about it? So before we dig into these questions, I hope your Sextember is going really well. I hope you and your spouse are being intentional about putting a little more effort into creating a great sexual relationship by identifying things that usually get in the way and improving on them. If you haven't heard of Sextember, it's not too late to download the Intimately Us app because all the information is in there and we'd love for you to participate in it. It's free too. We are getting very close to our couples retreat in Granbury, Texas. This retreat is going to be romantic, fun, as well as insightful and challenging in the very best sense. Marriage retreats are amazing because it's a time where both of you can work towards your goals as a couple at the same time in an accelerated fashion in this environment. And we still have a few spots open if you want this experience. You can get more details at getyourmarriageon.com and click on retreats. And later today, September 15th at 7 p.m. Central Time, we're hosting a special After Dark workshop all about role-play sex. After listening to this episode, you might want to join us live to see what it's all about. If you're listening to a recording of this episode after we did our live workshop, well, you're still in good hands. We have a replay available on our website under workshops. All right, let's talk about sexual fantasies. Last Sunday, while getting ready for church in our bedroom, my wife made a one-word comment that made us both laugh. She was playing with me. She was teasing me. And I was playing too. She knows some of my sexual fantasies, and her comment was directed at one of them. It's not something we're actually going to act out, and in fact, because we couldn't act it out, that's what made it a fantasy, and that's what kind of made it fun. But the fact that we can play in that space of what if for a moment was wonderful and beautiful. Sexual fantasies are using mental imagery of a sexual activity. Usually, sexual fantasies involve an emotional component too. Most of these mental images or scenes are enjoyable and arousing, but sometimes the mental images are unwanted and can leave you feeling guilty or ashamed, and we'll talk about that today. Sexual fantasies don't have to be salacious or gratuitous either. They can be vanilla, and I say vanilla in air quotes because there's absolutely nothing wrong with vanilla. Or your sexual fantasies can be quite spicy too. Fantasies can be a nice addition to your banquet of sexual experience. Sexual fantasies, used well, are not about replacing your current experience or your spouse, but kind of like those Russian nesting dolls, sexual fantasies add another layer or dimension to the core of the good that you already enjoy as a couple. The emotional component of fantasies is an important thing to note. For example, a few months ago, my wife and I were looking online to possibly buying a piece of furniture for our home. We came across a photo of a uniquely designed sofa that had models on the sofa in a very provocative pose. The expression on their faces was that of ecstasy and delight in each other's presence in their intimate moment. My mind went wild with all the possibilities that we could have if we had that sofa in our bedroom. I felt an urge to buy the sofa, not because I particularly like that sofa, but I wanted to feel what that couple was feeling. The feeling of abandon, lost in each other, feeling deep pleasure, feeling desired, and the pride I feel in my ability to turn on my wife because of how good I am at doing her. Those are the emotions that flooded into me. So sometimes, the fantasy is the vehicle, in this case, the endless possibilities of enjoying each other on a sofa, to a feeling that you're really after, in this case, abandon, desire, and self-esteem. By the way, now I know why they call it a love seat. Our brains are incredible sex organs and probably underutilized in most marriages. The better you can involve your mind in lovemaking, the more satisfying sex can become. Sexual fantasies use the creative part of your brain, and the human brain is good at fantasizing. Really good. In fact, according to a recent study by Dr. Justin Lee Miller, an American psychologist studying sexual fantasies, reported that 97% of adults have sexual fantasies. Sigmund Freud, over 150 years ago, used to think that fantasizing about sex was considered an illness. The thinking back then was that you fantasize because you're unsatisfied with your current sexual relationship. However, recent research and studies show that those who exhibit the fewest sexual issues in their relationship and the least dissatisfaction are likely to fantasize to the greatest extent. This is backed up by a review of findings released by the American Psychology Association in 1995 that concludes that sexual fantasy was neither a disease nor a mark of dissatisfaction. Thank goodness. They concluded that rather, not having sexual fantasies is considered a pathology because it's so common and natural to have sexual fantasies. And it's also really common to fantasize during sex. According to sex educator Lou Paget, most people fantasize during sex for 3 reasons. You're using your brain and imagination to kickstart, enhance, and add variety to the intimate experiences that are otherwise routine and regular as a way of remaining committed and monogamous to your spouse. She goes on to say, many people I speak with feel there must be something wrong or missing if they fantasize during sex about something sexual that 1, they have done before, 2, that they haven't done before, or 3, that involves someone other than their partner turning them on. It doesn't mean any of those things, she says. It just means you have a memory of what works for you, and there are ways to incorporate your preferences into your relationship. If your fantasies become the only condition that enables you to be intimate and sexually turned on, or if you become obsessive or compulsive about your particular fantasy, or if you're concerned that your fantasy could actually harm someone, perhaps that's a good time to get coaching. But other than that, if you have fantasies, I think they're really healthy and a good sign that you're in a good sexual relationship. Now, there's different kinds of fantasies. I would say sexual fantasies fall into one of three categories. 1, fantasies you keep to yourself and just don't share. Number 2, fantasies you share with your spouse that you would like to act out. Number 3, fantasies you share with your spouse that are just that, a fantasy, and should stay in the fantasy world, something you would never act out. It's fun and enjoyable to discuss and play in that area of fantasies that you'll just never really act out, that can just stay in that fantasy world. And it should stay there. For example, you may never actually want to have sex on the beach in the middle of the day. Getting caught or having sand on your private parts may just not be your thing. But this might be something you would love to engage in, at least in a fantasy world. You can imagine with your spouse how it would feel to be bathed in sunlight, with the sound of waves crashing in the distance, and how incredibly sexy it would be to feel naughty in that moment. You get the idea. You may choose to keep this as a fantasy and just play it out in your minds as a fantasy and never actually act it out. Sometimes your spouse might want something sexually that you feel you can't give them for whatever reason. It's common in many marriages to have differences in sexual preferences. For example, one person may want to engage in a wider variety of sex positions or behaviors than the other. So I got this tip from a book about parenting young children I read once, and I've used it in my parenting to some degree of success. And it also works in this scenario too. The author said something to the effect of, what you can't give in real life, you can give in fantasy. The scenario that the author pointed out was, let's say it's a half hour before dinner time and your child asks if they can have a bowl of ice cream. You don't think they should have ice cream right before dinner time. You could tell your child, no, that's a bad idea for even wanting ice cream when we're about to have dinner. Or you could give your child ice cream in a fantasy where you pantomime giving them scoops of ice cream onto an ice cream cone and handing it to them, and then asking your child, how does that taste? Sometimes the child just wants to be heard. They just want the experience of expressing their wants in the moment, rather than being scolded about their desires. And you can play with your child in that fantasy world. This principle also works sexually. You can play in the fantasy. This would be an opportunity to express acceptance and love for the other's sexuality by describing what you would do if you could do it, kind of like as a parent, like with the ice cream to your child. This has worked really well in my own marriage on occasion, and we both feel closer afterwards, even if the actual request wasn't granted. At least it can be granted in fantasy. In general, men's fantasies usually revolve around two feelings that they're after. Number 1, having amazing prowess and sexual skill. Masculine energy in general is directed, focused, erect, and about doing. Fantasies around being able to do better are common for men. The second common fantasy category for men usually revolves around doing something that drives their woman wild, out of her mind with pleasure. In fact, when you read journal accounts of men writing about their peak sexual experiences, 9 times out of 10, the man writes about how turned on the woman was and how pleasurable her experience was. For a large majority of men, they find so much joy, pleasure, and satisfaction out of bringing their wife to new heights of pleasure. Even if the sexual act is done on him, such as in the fantasy a woman performing oral sex on him, the fantasy usually revolves around her enjoyment of doing that act and her enjoyment about being really turned on by his essence in performing the act. So it wouldn't surprise me if that most fantasies that men have revolve around their wife's pleasure. On the other hand, women are more likely to fantasize about these 3 themes. 1, being seduced. 2, exercising the power of her sexuality. 3, being so desirable that men can't resist her. This is where many romance stories have their plot arc. For example, the Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice is appealing because he's willing to break social norms and to pursue Elizabeth Bennet, even after she rejects him over and over, because he finds her so compelling. You're now probably curious what other people's top fantasies are. Researchers have surveyed people on what their top fantasies are, but before I tell you the list, I want to share with you some tidbits of what I found comforting and are in line with my own experience too. In practice, research by sex expert Justin Lee Miller found that most adults fantasize about trying something new with their partners, not necessarily other people. This can include role-playing or acting like strangers with their spouse. We assume women predominantly want to be romanced, but men and women alike also had romantic fantasies, with both sexes expressing a desire to be loved, wanted, and appreciated. Another thing I found comforting in the research is about 9 out of 10 people surveyed fantasize about their own partners, with over 50% saying they did so often. Their most common fantasies involve trying something a little bit out of the book with their partner, rather than exploring very far out of the book stuff or very taboo or very forbidden scenarios. It's just a little bit outside the norm is what most people fantasize about. That being said, here are some categories of fantasies that people like. Number 1, the dominance or submission dynamic fantasy. I heard a story about a woman that's an attorney and owns her own law firm. Every day she's in a very masculine energy world, directing others in her company and work with clients and dealing with cases. However, she's married to a very gentle man, and he's really not the dominant type, which, by the way, that mix really works well in their relationship for the most part. However, in the bedroom, the last thing she wants is to be the boss again after being a boss all day at work. She craves to be submissive, just to be taken by him. One day, she got the guts to tell her husband that she wants him to tie her up and to have his way with her. He was taken aback by this request, as it really wasn't in his nature to behave that way. But because he loves this woman and was willing to try, and bonus points for being willing to try even if he might fail a lot along the way, he did it with gusto, and she absolutely loved surrendering to him. Dominance and submission need not include tying up your spouse. This could be playing out a fantasy like someone's in charge of the other, like a hierarchy of sorts, but it's part of the sexual play. This can include being in a role of authority, such as a doctor with a nurse or a teacher with a student. Number 2, romance and seduction. These fantasies are high in romance, flowers, gifts, going out of one's way, and maybe even breaking social norms because of a compelling desire to be with the other person. It's about singing love songs, opening doors, and filling a bubble bath topped with rose petals. This is about slow dancing to romantic music. There's also the part of seduction in these fantasies, such as dressing in a particular way to catch the other's eye, or just being so irresistible. A friend told me about a memorable wedding anniversary, where she and her husband decided ahead of time they were going to arrive at the Las Vegas hotel at different times and meet downstairs in the casino. They were going to pretend to be strangers, and his job was to try to hit on her and pick her up. The idea of being so compelling that a stranger, in this case, it's a pretend stranger, it's her husband, would just stop to talk to her and try to seduce her was super erotic for her and for both of them. Third common fantasy type is the voyeuristic, exhibitionistic fantasy. Just a reminder, we're talking about fantasy here, not real life. These two terms mean you're being viewed or you're showing off your sexiness somehow. Fantasies in this category might include undressing where your spouse can see you, or showering or bathing and letting them watch you sensually touch yourself in the process. Some people find it hot to be looked upon, and others find it really fun to look. Number 4, the forbidden. Sometimes a fantasy is exciting just because it's forbidden. In podcast episode 80, my guest Jessica Vaughn shared a story about how she and her husband decided to sneak out onto a soccer field in the middle of the night to have sex. The thrill of doing something risky was really exciting to both of them. Just as they were cleaning up after themselves after thoroughly enjoying their lovemaking session on the lawn, 2 police cars pulled up and, well, you'll have to listen to that episode if you want to find out what happens next. But you can see how doing something naughty and forbidden can be exciting because it's naughty and forbidden. Same goes with certain sex acts or locations that are exciting precisely because they're naughty or forbidden to do. Some fantasies involving 2 strangers meeting up and having wild, passionate sex is exciting precisely because it's forbidden to do such a thing. Number 5 common fantasy, according to the research as they survey people, group sex, such as threesomes. These are common fantasies that people have. One person explained to me why this fantasy was so exciting to him. To him, it's the idea that he's so manly and sexual that one woman at a time just isn't enough. That he's so good at sex, he can satisfy 2 women at once. Just for the record, this isn't something I'm endorsing. I believe sex is to be between a married couple only. But the feelings that this fantasy puts off can be part of your intimate play with a little bit of creativity. Now, you might have a fantasy you don't want to have, that you're ashamed of it, that you don't like this particular sexual image that pops up in your mind over and over again. Sometimes you want to unthink something, but struggle to do so. For example, on the freeway from our home down to Las Vegas, off to the side of the road is a statue of a large pink elephant. I don't know how long it's been there or why it's there or how it got there. Once a friend pointed it out to me, it's impossible for me to drive by now and not look for that unusual pink elephant. If I tell you not to think about that pink elephant, you just can't. It's because your brains only know what to do, not do, if that makes sense. So the trick in this situation where you have a fantasy you don't want to think, then, is to focus your mind on something else to do rather than not do. Can you reframe your fantasy into a version that you like? Can you replace that thought with another thought that you are happier with? Now, what if you're listening to this episode and still think, gosh, I really don't know what my fantasies are, or if I even have any? Not to worry. Just remember that what people fantasize about is not necessarily synonymous with what they are interested in doing in person. It doesn't mean you have to actually do it. These are just fantasy. These are ideas. These are just thoughts that you might find creative and interesting. Perhaps you can stretch yourself a bit, though, by pulling out a sheet of paper and taking this assignment seriously. Begin writing down themes, ideas, maybe movie scenes or stories from a book, memories, and so on of things that you've found particularly arousing or sexually interesting. If that's difficult to do, it might be a homework assignment that you give yourself for a week to seek out things you find sexually arousing. One woman that did this week-long exercise reported that it wasn't until Sunday after the church meeting ended when she saw her husband help take down the chairs and joking around with another older couple in their congregation. And she looked at him at that moment, and all of a sudden she had all this desire for him. She thought, he is so hot, standing there, looking good in his suit, at ease with that older couple, and serving other people. Somewhere in there, she found her sexual images in her mind that really got her excited. That kind of cued her for her fantasies. Another exercise you can try is the finish the sentence game. You and your spouse can write your own story. This is where one person writes a line and the other person writes the next line, and so on. Some starting lines could be, she walked in the room wearing blank. Or, he asked her to meet him at such and such a place. Or, he walked to the room with blank in his hand, and so on. Anyway, a little practice can really wake up your imagination. Sharing one's fantasies with their spouse is one of the most intimate acts you can do in your marriage. In fact, couples find it easier to have intercourse with their spouse rather than to share their minds around their fantasies. It's scary to share this deep aspect of yourself. There's a fear of rejection or what the other person might think. There's a fear that your fantasies are somehow unscrupulous. And let's get real, chances are they probably are unscrupulous. That's why they're a fantasy. You might have past experience with your spouse or others where your sexual desires weren't respected or listened to. You might know your spouse well enough already that you can pretty much predict that they're not going to like hearing your fantasies again. Anytime you reveal your mind to your spouse, or without judgment, you let your spouse reveal his or her mind to you, is an act of intimacy. Sometimes it takes a lot of courage to be honest when it's uncomfortable to do so. This process, though, as uncomfortable and awkward as it is the very path couples need to take in order to forge a stronger version of themselves and become more intimate as a couple. I'm reminded of the scene in the movie A Few Good Men, where the character played by Tom Cruise, an attorney, asks the character played by Jack Nicklaus, a general in the army, for the truth about what happened in a military court trial. He demands, "We just want the truth." And the general responds loudly, "You can't handle the truth." Sometimes we create a marriage where we can't handle the truth. We stop our own ability to have more deep, intimate marriages because we freak out when our spouse starts to share some of their fantasies with us. Because we're uncomfortable about their eroticism or afraid what might come out of their mind, we are quick to shut them down. So part of growing in love is to develop a deeper capacity to handle the truth, so to speak, or to be able to handle our spouse fully and create a safe emotional space for your spouse to share. It doesn't mean you have to act on his or her fantasies. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It doesn't also mean you have to soothe your spouse or pretend that what they want is perfectly fine when you disagree with that. It's just that you suspend moral judgment about the fantasy for now. A black belt move in this scenario is to create a marriage where there's room for two people in the marriage, two very different people with two very different ideas to have equal space at the table. Someone once said it this way: don't yuck another person's yum. But what if you're turned off by your spouse's fantasy, especially when he or she brings it up so often? Here are 3 ideas that might help you in this situation. First of all, discern if this is just a fantasy or turning into an obsession. Some people, especially driven and successful people, can be a bit obsessive about an idea. I'm not saying they're like clinically OCD, but what I mean is that they have an ability to latch onto an idea and drive it until they get it. It's like part of their superpower that makes them successful. On the other hand, this trait can become maladaptive if they obsess over their fantasy, especially something they really want, but you don't want to do it. Take this into account as you watch their behavior. Second, it's okay to have no's and non-negotiables. You don't ever have to do anything sexually, in reality or fantasy, that you don't want to do. You're the captain of your ship. I once heard about a couple where one person wanted to explore opening up the marriage to other partners. This was a hard no and non-negotiable for the other person. You need to grow a backbone and stand up for the important things so that you can stay in integrity with yourself. Third, be honest. Express that the fantasy is a turnoff for you. Being good lovers means knowing what their spouse's turn-ons and turn-offs are. So here's a good opportunity for your spouse to learn and hear from you and get some helpful feedback. I want to reiterate that there's so much value in creating emotional safety in your relationship. This trust is formed by being committed to each other, fully choosing each other, and being trustworthy, doing what you'll say you'll do, even in the littlest things. People sometimes ask me, how can I share my fantasies with my spouse without feeling awkward? And I don't have a good answer. I think it will always be awkward. In my mind, it's not about taking away the awkwardness, but it's more about your ability to tolerate that it's awkward and having the inner strength to share your inner, darker, hidden parts of yourself in spite of the awkwardness of it all. I also want to say this. It's important to honor what your spouse says are his or her fantasies, even if they don't fit your model of what a fantasy is. I once overheard a conversation between a couple where the husband tends to be quite sexually adventurous in their relationship, and his wife, let's just say she's a lot more reserved. He was asking her to tell him her fantasies. So she told him her fantasies, and he responded, "No, that's not a fantasy. That's something we already do. So tell me what your fantasies are." She again told him a few ideas and some mental images of what she found sexually appealing and interesting. He didn't like what he was hearing because her version of a fantasy wasn't his idea of a fantasy. What he was really doing was fishing for her to share something he wanted her to say, not necessarily being really open to her heart of the matter and listening to what she was saying. Does that make sense? I would think that a wiser version of the husband would accept that what his wife was honestly expressing to him had as much weight and value as his own fantasies in this relationship, even if what she was expressing was different than what he had in mind of what a fantasy is. And just because his fantasies are more adventurous, they don't necessarily take precedence or are more valuable than hers. You need room for two. There's room for both of you in this marriage to fully express your fantasies. And not one person is dominating the other, or one person's version of what sex should be runs the show more than the other person. If you and your spouse would like more help with this topic, or building a stronger relationship where there's room for two of you to bring your full fantasies together and to enjoy something deeper and richer, I want to invite you to work with me through my Next Level program. It includes marriage coaching, plus resources geared to help you in your relationship so you can reach your next level. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If anything I've said today was valuable to you and helpful in your marriage, please share it with some of your married friends, and I promise they will thank you for life. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you're interested in accelerating growth in your marriage, either sexually, emotionally, or spiritually, I want to invite you to work with me in my affordable coaching program called Next Level. More information about Next Level and my fun and sexy apps for couples are available at getyourmarriageon.com. Please also don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a single episode. And be sure to tell your married friends. I promise, they will thank you for life. Now go get your marriage on.